welcome to my second video in our first series for making an action RPG in Unity. And in this video, we have just finished building one map for the player to explore on. And it was comprised of multiple layers. And in this video, we're going to set up the collision and the colliders so that when we do add a player, which will be the second video, or the third video, the next one, the player will be able to interact with all these edges and wouldn't be able to walk through the walls, wouldn't be able to walk through the cliffs. So we're going to set up all those colliders, and then I'm also going to take a look at putting trees in as individual objects rather than painting them on the tile map. I think it is easier to interact with them as an individual object and to set up some of, like, you know, how the player can appear in front of the tree if they're standing in front, and then behind if they're behind it. So setting that up. So with that said, let's kind of take a look at this, and there's a few changes I need to make right at the start. And first up, that's I painted the water on the blocking low layer. So if I disable all of my other layers, we can see that I painted water and the ledges here on blocking low. But that I put the details under it. And so I'm not seeing the water details appearing on top of that. So I do actually want to reorder those inside of my list here. So I'm going to just drag blocking low in above details. And I'm going to swap their layer orders. So blocking low is now going to be -40 on the order in layer. And details is going to be -30 on the layer order, as long as I manage to not type a decimal here. And so that way now I can kind of see those, and I see that I've got to move that one little piece there. So I make sure I'm on the details layer. I got the eraser selected, and I can go through and erase that. So a few things that I do want to point out that could have happened to your tile map, and things that we are going to have to care about. So let's say you were working on the ground and you had painted some stuff, and then you decided that you really didn't want that and you wanted to get rid of it. What could happen is your ground may actually end up registering to be too big. And let's see. So if that happens to you, it might actually think that your ground tile map is meant to be larger. You can actually tell it to kind of recalculate the bounds of your tile map by going to the triple dots next to tile map and then choosing compress tile map bounds. That will like recalculate the edges of your map, which could be a very useful thing to do, because like if you paint these tiles, it may think that you have 2 more tiles over here, and that's going to get in the way of how we're going to calculate the boundaries for our camera, because it is important for this ground layer to basically be the size of the stage, because that is what we are going to use down the road to control where the camera is allowed to actually scroll. Other things I didn't mention in the first video, but I do put my cliffs and trees on the blocking high layer. So I didn't do any cliffs in the original video, but these cliffs are on blocking high. Additionally, once I start getting the player in here, I am probably going to have to start thinking about changing this part. So honestly, I think I'm on blocking high. I'm probably going to want to... I have my eraser tool selected right now. Erase those and actually paint that on the treetops layer. Maybe I'll paint this one on the treetops. Oh wait, I want that to be under the player. So let's go paint that on. We can either do details or paths. Let's go details. And we'll paint that one on details. And we want the player to be able to walk under this for our transition. So I think this upper part here is going to need to go on treetops. If you select the layer over here, it does change your palette. So my palette is switching to treetops as I'm going to paint this top thing here. That way it'll look like the player is walking underneath this little ledge here, but the rest of this is still going to be considered blocking high to prevent player movement. And the player won't be able to just aimlessly wander up here because there's going to be a zone transition right here, so it's not going to let the player just sneak up there. If we were really worried, we could put a box there, and we're going to take a look at setting up basically invisible walls to keep the player out of stuff. Okay, so we've got all that. Now we do have to retool a few things, and I guess let's build our colliders first, then let's see why we have to retool this. So let's start by going to blocking low, and we want to start creating a collider for this to prevent players and monsters from walking through it. So we can go to Components, Physics 2D. Oh, I'm sorry, that's under Tilemap. Tilemap, and then we want to use a Tilemap Collider 2D. So that actually creates a collider out of all of this. You can see it turned on this green mesh to indicate where there's going to be some collisions. And we can kind of see that's going to create an issue there. So this green outline is our collider. Now, for performance reasons, we want to also have a composite collider anytime we use a Tilemap collider. So we're going to add a component, Physics 2D, and a composite collider. That also forces you to add a rigid body 2D, which is okay. We want to change this rigid body to static, because it's never going to move, it's the walls. So make that static, and then in the Tilemap, we have to tell it that it's being used by the composite over here. And that will create, basically if the two tiles are next to each other, it doesn't calculate collisions there. So it'll save you, like it won't subdivide all of this. It just makes one solid region out of it, which is really convenient for a performance standpoint. Secondly, we have the problem of the fact that this tile is going to be considered to be colliding as a right angle. It's a full tile of a collider. You can actually, if you're really astute, you can see that I have already adjusted some of these colliders. So if you're looking, you can actually see I have done some of them. But by default, they're going to be squares. And this is somewhat time consuming. And so let's take a look at fixing this, because you can see that this edge here is just going to be a solid square. And we actually kind of want more of a curve to it, because if you look at it visually, it kind of curves. So to fix that, we want to go to our the actual thing that we made the sprites from. So we're not actually going to look at our tile palette at the moment. So we're going to go to my grassland, where I did my multiple sprites, and I'm going to go to Sprite Editor. You'll notice that Generate Physics Shape is checked. That means if I don't otherwise define a physics shape, it will make one for me in the form of a square. So I pop open the Sprite Editor. Oops. And we see this. Let's go and select the tile in question. So I'm actually going to pay most of the attention to these ones, the ones that were my water boundaries, because these are part of my collider for that colliding low region. We don't have to worry about the fences because it's transparent, it's generating a collider only on the parts that have pixels. So it's basically using the transparency map, the alpha map, to determine where it's going to build its colliders. So it's actually building a collider around here. From a performance standpoint, you may want to edit the physics shape and take this out, but I'm not going to worry about that. And you can see the problem with all these other tiles, they're considered to be solid. And clearly the player is going to walk on the grass. So to fix that, select the tile, then go to Sprite Editor dropdown, Custom Physics Shape, And then you won't see any like dragging things, and that's because it hasn't built a custom physics shape. We actually have to go click generate, and it will put these little handles in the corner. You can drag them to where you want your physics shape to be determined, and then this is what it's going to use for the collider. You can add more to try to give it a better curve and a more true, like, to the shape curve. Oops. If you add ones you don't want, if you click on them and push delete, it will delete the shape. If you choose to delete all of these, it'll actually delete that physics shape, meaning it will go back to making a default shape for it. So that's actually convenient. If you just delete out the entire shape, it goes back to doing a default for you. So I'm going to pick something here. That looks reasonably good. I don't want it to be too weird because I don't want the player to snag on it. So like you really don't want to do something like this because then the player is going to like get hooked on it. So, you know, don't try to like sawtooth your collider box. And honestly, I think just keeping these 4 points is plenty fine. So that's what I want. Now, I've actually already done all of these other ones. Just trying to make sure that these colliders are kind of lining up in a similar location. Okay. So I've actually already done all of those. And so you may want to take some time and actually go build a collider for each of these. You should strive to try to make them on the edge, otherwise it does have some problems. And I'll show you how you can see that. So anyway, so build your colliders for this. When you're done, hit apply. Don't hit revert. Revert doesn't even ask you if you want to revert. It just undoes it. So maybe hit apply after each few that you do. All right, so that looks good. And we are good with this. So we can close this. Now, if we're going to go back and inspect my collider on here, you can actually see there's these little like divots because I messed up my collider here. So you can see these like green spikes inward, and that's not good. That's going to cause us some computation issues. So I fixed that when I went back to there. Notice though it's not updating this collider. The only way you can get it to update it is to actually right click on the Tilemap collider 2D and then tell it to reset. When you do that, it does clear out the use by composite flag, so recheck the use by composite, and you can see that it did fix my collider right here, and now it is using that green line appropriately. And I think I fixed the ones on the side because I don't see those green spikes inward anymore. See, this is mildly concerning. It's like, why do we have this region on the fence? But I'm not going to fix that. Anyway, so that should then fix there. But the next issue we have to concern ourselves with is the bridge. Because if I have a collider here, the player is not going to be able to step on the bridge at all because he's going to be considered to be blocked by the water. So I probably want to take these out of the blocking low tile map. So I'm just going to pull up my tile eraser, and I am going to take out those tiles. But I do need to replace them somewhere. So probably details might be fine, maybe paths, because paths really don't overlap with these edges. So it really doesn't matter where I place these. Ground still has its ground everywhere, so we will go pick my water. And I'm going to I'll paint the water on the ground layer. Those two spots. And then I'm going to paint the other things on the path layer. And so you can see underneath that bridge, I'm actually fixing that. And so the bridge looks natural, but then more importantly, collider-wise, we can actually see the colliders are ending here, which will allow the player just to walk through there. The last colliders we want to add are some on the blocking high layer, so we're going to do the same exact thing. We're going to go to Component, Component Tilemap, Tilemap Collider 2D, and you can see it building its things here. Because these were already transparent on the original tile map itself, it already created the shape, the collider shape right here for us. So, I mean, we could go through and fine tune it if we really wanted to, because it does look a little bit messy. So I would think if you wanted to care about performance, you might want to consider loading up the physics shape and cleaning this up significantly, because this will impact performance if you had a lot of things inside your game. And it's something that will take you about 30 minutes, but will save you on the physics computations. However, I'm going to skip that, because like I said, that takes time. We have our tile map collider, and we want to add our composite collider. So check on tile map collider to use by composite. Rigid body is being switched to static, and that's about all we need to change. Material is something that once we get a player moving, we're going to play with. Material allows you to change the bounciness and friction, so that if your player is rubbing, kind of like stuck against the wall, and they're moving in such a way that they're rubbing against the wall, if you have a high friction, it makes it so that the wall actually slows you down. If you have a low friction, it allows so the player's movement doesn't get impeded if they're like hugging the wall and moving left at the same time. All right, so we've got our colliders set up. And let's do the trees. So let's make some tree objects. So inside of textures, and I think because these aren't truly tile sets, I'm going to make a new folder inside of textures. And I'm going to call these Doodads. Doodads are things on the map that aren't part of the tile map, but are placeable objects that may or may not be interactable with the player. In general, they're not interactable, but they might block pathing. I know that term's dates back to at least StarCraft 1. They called them Doodads. So you can build the sprites from the actual sprite map, but I've actually kind of cut out some of them so that it's a little bit easier to work with. So I've already kind of extracted some of these, and so for instance, this tree, I actually cut these out of those sprite maps. So let's take a few of these and load them into the Doodads folder. I guess I'm going to take the whole set, and we're going to plop those into Doodads. And so I've got all of my things loaded up as sprites. We may need to go change the pixels per unit, because these are all designed on a 128 scale. So I'm going to just change that. And notice I have them multi-selected, so I'm able to change more than one at the same time. I don't have to sit there doing it for each of these. And then filter mode from bilinear to point. If that's too pixelated, I can always change it to something else. And then when we're done, we click apply. Okay, so these sprites are ready to go. The additional advantage is I could have more control over the physics shape of these, but I'm going to actually end up adding my own colliders. So let's start with the tree. We're going to take tree 1 and just drag it into the hierarchy. And it plops a tree right there. Apparently right on the same as the main camera. Double check its transform, make sure it's 0, 0, 0. And then we're going to set up some of the stuff on the tree. So it's already got its sprite renderer set up, and all of that is fine. But we want to start putting a collider here to block the player. So we want to just add a component, physics 2D, and I think we could either go with a circle, we could go with a polygon. There's a lot you can do with these colliders. Like if you choose to do a polygon collider, we could probably go through in there and attempt to clean this thing up. Not a huge fan of the polygon collider. We could have rebuilt the physics shape here to have a better collider for it. But I think the simplest thing to do would either to go with a circle collider or maybe a capsule collider. So physics 2D capsule collider. And I want it to be where the trunk is. So I'm going to switch it to horizontal. I'm going to go to edit mode, and I'm just going to kind of drag and resize this thing so that the collider is where the trunk of the tree is within reason. So that's going to be my tree's collider where the player is not allowed to walk for there. So exit the edit mode for the collider, and now we've got my tree. Let's rename it to just tree. And let's make ourselves a prefabs folder. Create a folder, prefab. Inside that prefabs folder, I'm going to make another folder called Doodads. And so I'm going to take the tree, and right now the tree is as good as I need it to be, and we're going to drag and drop it into the Doodads folder. So now I can place these trees wherever I want them. So I kind of thinking about where would it make sense to put a few. So I feel bad. It's like I'm putting the tree to cover that path that I just made. It looks so good, too. So this is kind of something to keep in mind is this problem, which, due to how we are actually computing the height of the treetops region, that may be somewhat problematic because the tree will never stack on top of that. So we could try to avoid that completely. We could try to make another one here that's not going to be as tall as the tree. That might be something we're going to have to come back and fix when we get to the scripting time, because these trees are going to determine their stacking order via scripting. So this order and layer is going to be dynamically computed. So we may have to wait until we have that script ready to play with this to make it all like play nicely. I'm going to leave that tree there so that we will fix that in the future, though. And a tree there. All right, so let's go add a few more doodads just to add some variety. We can do the same thing with the tree stump. We can plop it into the world, give it a collider. So probably again a capsule collider seems like it's going to make the most sense. Switch it to horizontal, go to edit. And we are going to make it so the player will appear behind it when the player is behind it, so don't need to worry too much. So there's my tree stump. Turn that into a doodad. And I'm going to go put my tree stump somewhere. And the last one, and I want to add these because I want these to be a different type. This reed. This reed is going to be one that isn't going to block player movement, but it'll appear like grass for the player. So we're going to put the reed in. And this thing is not going to use a collider because it's not going to block the player. So it's actually going to be turned into a doodad right now. So I can go put the reeds somewhere. The only kind of issue I do have with the reed is because it's 3 individual stalks, honestly, we would be better off turning this into 3 separate doodads because we're going to run into the issue of what if the player stands, right here, where they're behind this one but in front of this one, it's going to look unnatural for ours. So like if you were going to go and try to make something professional out of this, you'd want to consider turning each one of these 3 parts of the reed into 3 separate doodads, because then you can calculate the point that the player stacks is like right here. So we've added those just to kind of give, you know, a little more mystery to the level. Okay, so we've got some doodads. We've got a nicely decorated, perhaps a little too cluttered, but it's fine. And we've got some exits. Last thing I want to show before because we should be ready to test this with the player next, is to put invisible bounding boxes. So those are actually easier than it seems. And again, it may or may not be fair. Maybe you want to have this entire edge be a transition zone, or maybe you only want the transition to happen if the player walks off the path. But just to demonstrate invisible boxes, let's do some invisible collisions. So we're going to create an empty game object, and I'm going to call this invisible wall. Reset its transform, because I see that Z has got some weird values. And then I'm going to give it a component of a box collider. I'm going to position approximately where I'd want it. And then knowing that this box is a size 1, I probably can set this to like -0.65, and then this X value doesn't really matter. And I can edit this box collider to be as big as I would need it. So something like this to keep the player contained. Now, here's the problem. When I deselect it, it's completely invisible and I don't even know it's there anymore. So we're going to use one of these object labels so that we can find it again. So click on this and choose a color that you think makes sense for invisible walls. I'm kind of feeling red, so that we know that there's an invisible wall there, and we can click on it to see its bounding box. And so I would recommend kind of placing an invisible wall around the perimeter of the level, except for in areas maybe you want the player to go off. So if you want the player to walk off this entire edge to transition, well then consider making your invisible wall only go to like here. Because you know, if you want the player just to walk off here and then have it load the next scene, we can do that. But if you wanted to kind of keep it so the player can only walk off through the path, then we will make the invisible wall like this. And so I'll finish the rest of these invisible walls in between videos. So when we see this video again, I'll have my invisible walls made. I will probably put one up here just to kind of keep the player from sneaking through all that non-collidable stuff. And next video, we're going to actually build the player, give him some rudimentary movement, and we're going to start working on getting these layers to stack appropriately and start doing the player's walking animation. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next video.